The disappearance of the Nabataean kingdom. In the year 106 CE, a Roman legion marched into the heart of Arabia and annexed one of the ancient world's most formidable trading empires without significant resistance. The kingdom that vanished that year had commanded the desert for nearly 4 centuries. It had grown fabulously wealthy by moving goods that the great empires of Rome and China desperately wanted. Yet within 2 centuries of Rome's arrival, the Nabataean kingdom would be completely erased. Not destroyed in some catastrophic war, but absorbed, diminished, and forgotten so thoroughly that later historians would struggle even to remember its name. Today, if you mention the Nabataeans to most people, you'll encounter blank stares. Yet their legacy remains carved into the landscape itself. In southern Jordan, hidden among rust-colored cliffs and wind-scoured gorges, lies the city of Petra, a vast metropolis carved entirely from living rock. Its facades glow crimson and gold at sunset, so surreal in appearance that early European explorers suspected it was a phantasm, a trick of light and stone. Petra was the capital of the Nabataean kingdom, and it stands as perhaps the most haunting monument to a civilization that learned too late that controlling the trade routes was not enough to ensure survival. The story of how an empire built on water, ingenuity, and commercial acumen simply dissolved is not one of conquest or plague or natural catastrophe. It is far more subtle and in some ways more tragic. It is a story about how the world changes beneath your feet while you grow comfortable, about how controlling the past does not guarantee the future, and about the profound vulnerability of prosperity itself. To understand what happened to the Nabataeans, we must first understand what they built. In the 4th century BCE, long before Rome had more than regional power, a group of Arabian traders established themselves in the harsh desert landscapes between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. We know almost nothing of their earliest origins. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, provides our first detailed account of them as a people, and by then they were already well established. But archaeology suggests that by the late 4th century, the Nabataeans had begun to consolidate control over the trade routes that threaded through Arabia like the veins of some vast, slumbering creature. The Nabataean genius was not military conquest. They did not build an empire through the overwhelming force that characterized Rome or the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Persian Empire. Instead, they built an empire on 3 foundations: water, guile, and an absolute mastery of the desert itself. The Arabian desert is one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. It is a landscape of extremes: crushing heat, scarce water, wind that can strip the skin. For most ancient peoples, crossing it was an ordeal to be endured only when absolutely necessary. But the Nabataeans studied this landscape until they understood it like no other people did. They learned where to find hidden aquifers beneath the sand. They engineered cisterns that captured rare rainfall and held it against months of drought. They built an intricate network of forts, way stations, and strongholds connected by routes that only they knew. A Nabataean trader could cross 200 kilometers of waterless desert carrying heavy merchandise while a Roman soldier would have perished after 50. The desert had become not their enemy but their greatest asset. A protection, a fortress, a highway that only they could navigate with true confidence. And what they were navigating along this desert highway was perhaps the most valuable trade in the ancient world: incense. Modern people tend to think of incense as a luxury, a pleasant smell for a temple or a prayer house. But in the ancient world, incense, particularly frankincense and myrrh, held an almost sacred commercial value. These resins were produced in southern Arabia, in the region known as the Hadramaut, and nowhere else on Earth. They were intensely aromatic, they preserved well over long journeys, and they were desperately wanted by virtually every sophisticated civilization from Rome to Egypt to the Greek kingdoms. Frankincense was burned in temples, used in perfumes, employed in medicines, and central to burial rituals. For the wealthy and powerful, incense was as essential as gold. The Nabataeans positioned themselves as the sole middlemen in this trade. Merchants from the south would bring their precious incense to Nabataean territories, and the Nabataeans would then transport it north to Judea, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world. They were not producers. They were not soldiers. They were merchants, and their monopoly was complete. They understood that controlling the trade route meant controlling the price, and they used that power ruthlessly. They maintained their position not through overwhelming military might but through superior knowledge, through an intricate network of local alliances and intelligence, and through sheer economic leverage. By the 1st century BCE, the Nabataeans had established their capital at Petra, a city that seemed to emerge from the wilderness itself. Petra was chosen with strategic brilliance. It was a natural fortress, nearly impregnable, yet positioned perfectly along the caravan routes. Massive caravans carrying frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk would pass through Nabataean territory, and at Petra, those goods would be consolidated, taxed, and redistributed. The kingdom grew fantastically wealthy. The Nabataean kings accumulated enough resources to mint their own coinage, maintain their own armies, and negotiate with Rome from a position of genuine strength. The wealth of Petra was visible in its architecture. The city was carved directly from the living rock, not haphazardly, but with a level of ambition and engineering mastery that still astounds. The facades of tombs and temples rose 5, 6, even 7 stories high, their surfaces adorned with carved columns, Hellenistic elements, and intricate geometric patterns. Inside, royal chambers were hewn from the stone with such precision that some required no mortar, the blocks fitting together with mathematical exactness. Water channels were carved into the rock itself, invisible to the casual observer, conducting precious liquid from spring to cistern to public fountain. Everything in Petra spoke of wealth, sophistication, and permanence. The Nabataeans had built a city that seemed as eternal as the stone from which it emerged. The kingdom maintained its independence and its prosperity for roughly 3 centuries. Kings such as Aretas III and Obodas III ruled with considerable power, controlling not just trade routes but significant territorial holdings in the Levant. They were known to Greek and Roman writers as formidable rulers, not to be dismissed or easily conquered. The Nabataeans enjoyed the best of both worlds. They maintained their independence while trading with every major power in the Mediterranean world. Rome, Egypt, and the Hellenistic kingdoms all wanted what the Nabataeans controlled, and the Nabataeans had learned to profit from each relationship without allowing any single power to dominate them entirely. Yet, by the turn of the 1st century CE, subtle currents had begun to shift in ways the Nabataean merchant princes may not have fully appreciated. Rome had recently completed its conquest of Egypt, and with it came not just territorial expansion but something more significant. Rome had gained direct access to the Red Sea. Rome had always traded with Arabia, but now Rome could project power onto the sea lanes themselves. More troubling still, Roman naval technology and Roman military resources made Rome capable of something the Nabataeans had never seriously faced: an invasion force that could be supplied entirely by sea, independent of desert water supplies and caravan logistics. But the deeper threat was something else entirely. It was not a threat that could be seen coming across the desert or spotted on the horizon. It was something that would take decades to fully manifest, something rooted in geography, in human ambition, and in the simple fact that the world was beginning to find new ways to move its precious goods. #The disappearance of the Nabataean kingdom. The final narration. The Silk Roads were beginning to open. For centuries, the Nabataeans had profited because they sat at the intersection of 2 worlds, the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. But now, as Roman power extended eastward and as trade networks began to stretch overland through Central Asia and by sea along routes that bypassed the Arabian Peninsula entirely, the geography that had made the Nabataeans indispensable began, almost imperceptibly, to make them irrelevant. There was no single catastrophe. There was no final battle. No last king standing defiant in Petra's rose-red canyons. What happened instead was far more subtle, and in some ways far more devastating. The Nabataean kingdom simply ceased to be economically necessary. Around 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan annexed what remained of Nabataean territory, transforming it into the Roman province of Arabia Petrea. It was, by most accounts, a bloodless affair. There are few historical records of resistance, few accounts of desperate last stands. The kingdom that had outlasted the Seleucids and Ptolemies, that had navigated the rise of Rome itself, simply dissolved into the imperial administrative structure. The Nabataean kings vanished from history as quietly as they had once moved through the desert. What followed was a long, slow fade. Petra, that marvel of engineering and artistry carved into the mountains, did not empty overnight. The city continued to function, though no longer as the nerve center of a merchant empire. It became instead a provincial Roman town, its grandeur gradually diminishing, its merchants gradually moving on. The trade routes that had enriched it were being redrawn by forces beyond anyone's control, by geography, by the opening of new sea lanes, by the shifting currents of global commerce. By the 3rd century, Petra was already in decline. By the 4th and 5th centuries, as the Roman Empire itself fragmented and Christianity spread through the region, the old pagan trading networks that had sustained Nabataean civilization faded into obscurity. The city that had once bustled with merchants from 3 continents, that had gleamed with the wealth of frankincense and myrrh and spices from across the Indian Ocean, became a place of ghosts. Eventually, it was buried beneath centuries of sand and forgetting. When European explorers finally rediscovered Petra in 1812, led by Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, they found only ruins. The magnificent carved facade still stood, weathered but unbroken, their rose-red stone glowing in the desert sun. But the city itself was empty. The merchants were gone. The caravans no longer came. The Nabataean people had long since been absorbed into the surrounding Arab populations, their language evolving into modern Arabic, their cultural identity merging with the broader Islamic civilization that would eventually flourish across the same desert they had once commanded. What is perhaps most striking about the disappearance of the Nabataeans is what it tells us about the fragility of power built on geography and commerce. The kingdom endured for more than 4 centuries, longer than many great empires. It grew wealthy and sophisticated. It created remarkable architecture, developed writing systems, and maintained the kind of administrative structures that allowed it to manage vast networks of trade. The Nabataeans were not conquered by a rival empire in their prime. They were not destroyed by invading armies or famine or plague. They were made obsolete. The world moved on. The same trade routes that had enriched Petra lost their importance as other routes opened elsewhere. The same geographical advantages that had placed them at the center of the ancient world now meant nothing when that world's center of gravity shifted. The Nabataeans had built an entire civilization on the principle of adaptation, on the ability to navigate between empires and profit from chaos. But they could not adapt to a world where they were simply no longer needed. In the desert where Petra stands, the temperature still climbs past 50 degrees Celsius in summer. The pink cliffs still rise majestically from the sandy floor. Flash floods still occasionally sweep through the canyons with terrible force, reminding anyone who visits that the desert remains indifferent to human ambition. The treasury still stands, its facade still carved with that perfect classical precision, still radiating a sense of permanence and grandeur. But it is permanence of a different kind now, not the permanence of a living, thriving civilization, but the permanence of memory, of archaeology, of a great power that once was. Walking through Petra today, it is possible to imagine the sounds of the ancient city. Merchants haggling in Aramaic, the bells of caravans departing at dawn, the voices of craftsmen and traders and families living out their daily lives in the shadow of those magnificent cliffs. But these are the sounds of imagination. The actual voices of the Nabataeans are lost to history. What remains is stone and silence, and the profound reminder that even the greatest empires are temporary. The Nabataeans proved that brilliance, wealth, and sophistication are not enough to ensure survival. The tide of history moves according to forces larger than any kingdom, larger than any merchant prince or ambitious ruler. Geography shapes us, commerce defines us, and the world's attention, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim. The Nabataean kingdom did not disappear in a moment. It evaporated slowly, over decades and centuries, like water from the desert itself. One day it simply ceased to exist, and in the empty canyons of Petra, in the ruins of their cities, in the faded inscriptions on forgotten tombs, the Nabataeans remain. A cautionary tale of a civilization that understood the world perhaps better than almost any other, yet could not ultimately control it. Tell us in the comments which lost civilization calls to you most deeply.